Hello and welcome to the latest installment of Odaseva's webinar series, Salesforce Data Mastery Q&A, How to Build for Large Data Volumes Like a Master Architect. Whether you're a Salesforce admin or a developer or architect, large data volumes can have a huge impact on your life. Designing and implementing solutions on the platform when you have a really large, complex org with lots of data and lots of users can get really tricky. And for that reason, Odaseva has reached out to the community to learn what large data volume questions are on your mind. And today, we're here to share some of the questions that we heard and also to offer our answers. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce our panel. And I'll start by introducing Anil Sistla, who is a platform lead at Schneider Electric. He's responsible for global architecture, governance, scalability, and sustainability of Schneider Electric's Salesforce implementation, which is one of the largest Salesforce orgs out there. I'm also joined by Carl Brundage, who is a master architect here at Odaseva, and he's also a Salesforce MVP and a certified technical architect. And finally, if we haven't met yet, my name is Susannah St. Germain. I am a technical architect here at Odaseva as well. I'm also a Salesforce MVP, and I have 20 Salesforce certifications. So why don't we dive right in with our Q&A? We've gone ahead and grouped the questions into a few categories. We're going to cover some of the basics around what exactly large data volumes are and why you should care. We'll then dive into some LDV best practices and how to mitigate large data volumes. And then finally, if time permits, we'll do a bit of a lightning round of some really specific and interesting questions that will hopefully challenge all of us to provide you guys with some pretty interesting answers. So starting with the basics, I have a question here from @mhumpalik on Twitter. And his question is, what is the number when large data volumes really start to matter? And why do you need to care about it? Why don't Carl, you give that question a stab?
Thanks, Susanna. So I'm going to start with the classic architect answer, right? Of it depends. But I'm going to follow that up with why I say that, because it's so dependent upon what you have going on in your org and whether you've planned for large data volumes or not. I've seen a lot of cases where when you're approaching even 1 million records, you can start seeing some of the negative effects. Reports are taking a long time to load. You go to that all list view and guess what? Nothing comes back. You just wait and wait and wait. So if you've started with a lot of the best practices from the start, doing things like avoiding skew, whether that's account skew or ownership skew or even lookup skew, that will help. Have you prepared for the way you want to think about list views and reports and make sure you have selective fields or fields that are indexed? That will help as well too. And then if you're doing things like loading in data on a regular basis, making sure you're loading lean, making sure you have efficient ways of querying. If you've done those things, then what I'd do is I'd turn to Trailhead because there's a little bit of guidance, some of the large data volume and big object trails that really say when you start getting into the millions, that's when you're going to see the impacts of large data volume. And when you get into the 20s of millions, 20 million, 25 or so forth, then you're really dealing with very large data volumes. And that's where you can think about keeping things off platform, external objects, other solutions to help mitigate those effects. But keep in mind, when you're at that level, you're not going to be able to just kind of jump in and do a SOCL statement. You're not going to say, well, let me see all my cases from last year. That's not going to return to you. It's going to time out when you try to execute that query. So you really have to be prepared for kind of those thresholds of getting into the millions and then getting into the tens or 20s of millions.
Excellent. So I think that really helps to give us some guidance. I know large data volumes can seem a little abstract sometimes. So we're talking millions, and then very large data volumes, we're talking 20 plus million. Thank you, Carl. So now we know sort of what LDV is, large data volumes. We know a little bit about why we should care. We have another great question from @Warunab on Twitter, and he is asking, what are the risks associated with LDV? Anil, I know you have a lot of experience working in a very large data volume org, so maybe you could provide us some answers on what some of the risks are.
Sure, Susannah. There are quite a bit of risk that you probably are going to be running into if you don't address the large data volumes, right? The first and the foremost thing, depending on the way how your data is and how, if you have, going back to what Carl was saying, if you're running reporting on these huge data volumes, you are going to be consuming so much resources on the platform, which is going to be impacting your users who are trying to perform the transactions on the platform, as well as there is a potential possibility of you bringing down the entire org of yours down and make it, basically get into a system unavailability, right? So it's very important that, you look at, the end-to-end on what is the kind of the data volume and what are the things that you're running on it. Is it the reporting? Is it the transactions? Is it the SQL queries? Is it the data extractions? When you club all these things that happen on the platform, you're basically taking away the resources that are available for processing your user requests, and that's impacting your user productivity because your users are starting to see the page loading taking longer. Your users are starting to see that, it takes to perform a transaction, it takes much longer than what it used to be. Your users are starting to see that, it takes sometimes, a lot of time. When I say a lot, probably running into minutes and minutes of time, where you're losing out on looking at a simple report, right? So these are just, this, what you can call as like when you scratch the surface, right? These are the simple issues that it look very simple, but actually potentially impacting your platform on a huge scale.
Absolutely. So a lot around impact to performance, right? And we all know that we want to make our system as performant as possible for our users who are using the Salesforce automations and tools that we're building. So I think those are really important considerations to be on the lookout for. So we've heard a little
Yeah,
bit.
absolutely.
Oh, go ahead, Anil.
And don't forget about that the more impacting your employees are, you're directly translating that to your customer experience, right? End of the day, your customer experience is what is impacting heavily, right? Let's say
Absolutely.
you are on a call with a customer care agent, with the customer. Your customer care agent is on a call with the customer, and if you're taking so long time to even open up a case, you're directly impacting your customer, who is probably not
Yes.
going to be willing to wait for that long.
Absolutely. Yes. Not just internal. I think that's a great reminder. Not just internal. There's impacts to the customer, our ultimate
Absolutely.
customer. Exactly. So with that in mind, I think that's a great transition to how do we start to solve some of these issues? We know that large data volumes can have impacts, but what are some best practices around mitigating those risks? So with that, I'll turn to a question we got from M.E. Hansen 82. And her question is, are there still limits that you might hit with large data volumes despite your effort to bulkify code or automations, and how do you deal with those? Carl, what do you think?
I like that we're already thinking about having best practices to bulkify code, like avoiding loops where we're querying more to avoid too many DML operations, making sure we have bulkified code. That's a great starting point. But if you think about it, well, maybe you go to the next step and you have a lot of data that you need to put into the system on a regular basis. You're updating information about shipments or orders, those sort of things. If you have these processes that are running, it's going to take time. And if you're sending things in through the bulk API, a million records, there's a certain number of time that you have for a batch before that batch times out. And then that batch can retry. And eventually your whole job will time out. So then you start splitting things into smaller batches, but eventually you run out of batches. So even though you've done the right things at a code level, you can run into problems when you start moving data in and out of the system. So the question becomes, what can you do about it? And we often talk with our customers about having a bypass strategy, a way that you can skip automations if you're coming in with data that you know is already summarized or already has the other things that the automations may be doing. And this can take different forms. I think a lot of folks may be familiar with trigger patterns where you can turn on and off triggers. But I know when I came in, I was less familiar with putting bypasses in things like workflows, process builders, flows, ways that you can check for a certain user, should you even execute this automation? And that saves a lot of time. I can give you some real world examples where for one customer to update 100,000 cases with batch Apex, it took about 6 to 7 hours of runtime. And that's because of triggers with lots of logic blocks, process builders, workflows, escalation, all these things. Once a bypass strategy was implemented, it took 10 minutes. So even though you have that in place, you can have a dramatic impact on how long it takes to do things in your org.
Excellent. No, so it sounds like it's not just we talk a lot about, large data volumes and working within the constraints of Salesforce, but it sounds like there's a lot that we can do as users to make sure that the things we're adding on top don't impact our large data volume experience even more. That's excellent. And that bypass strategy is a good one. I definitely recommend anyone listening to look into that as well. So in the same line around large data volumes, we have an excellent question from @Cher Feldman on Twitter. And her question is, what is the best way to avoid hitting governor limits when dealing with large data volumes, larger user bases, and complex use cases? So that's a very, very excellent question, Cheryl. And I think we'll probably, maybe a couple of us will take a stab. And why don't I go ahead and try and set the stage for this question a little bit, because it covers so much. So Cheryl mentioned avoiding hitting governor limits and implications of that. So as Anil actually hinted at the beginning of this webinar, it's important to remember that we're all operating in a multi-tenant environment with Salesforce. So that means that we're all sharing resources. And the whole reason that we have a thing called governor limits is so that there isn't one customer that's hogging all the resources and impacting performance, like we talked about, for other customers. So some of those governor limits that come into play that at a very important level, especially with complex use cases with data going in and out of Salesforce, are limits around APIs. So this is a bit of a surprise to some folks, because some limits we know with Salesforce are soft. You can go and say, well, Salesforce, can you increase my limits, to X, Y, or Z? But a lot of these API limits are strictly enforced for good reason. And just a quick example of how that might play out. If you're not aware of the different API limits that are governed by each different API, so each transaction can have a different limit. It's not just one and done, bulk 2 API limits or this. You need to know how the different operations have different limits as well. If you aren't aware of those and you pick the wrong, maybe not the best API for the job, you can start to run into these 24-hour rolling blocks, where if you exceed the number of API calls for a 24-hour rolling period, you have to wait until that next period opens up. And that can mean a pause to your business and ultimately, like Anil said, a pause to your customer. So that's extremely important to be aware of. And those are just some of the basic sort of in-your-face limits. I know, Carl, you had some thoughts around some sneaky limits that our customers often run into.
Yeah, I like to look at those sneaky limits because I think we're getting very familiar with doing the right thing from an architecture perspective when you start. You look at the number of users, especially with a large or complex org, you may have tens of thousands of users. So you calculate your data storage and you're like, I have terabytes of data storage. File storage, I have even more. So everything looks good. But did you know that if you're using Salesforce files, you can only put 30 million of them in Salesforce? So even though you may have 20 terabytes of file storage, if you put more than 30 million files in, pretty easy to do with email to case, you're gonna hit a limit and your system's gonna stop. Now, like Susannah mentioned, that's a soft limit. Salesforce may be willing to increase it, but eventually they won't. So you have to have a strategy for things like that. Another place, hey, you've looked at your partner community and you've said, hey, we're gonna be under 2 million users. That's great. But there's a limit on the number of roles that you can have. So you may have set up your partner community to create 3 roles each time you have a new partner. Well, the soft limit's 10,000. That's not going to give you a whole lot of partners. Salesforce, if you have a really well documented business case, they'll let you go up to 500,000. But think about that. 500,000 divided by 3, that's only 200,000 unique partners in your community. Maybe that's not going to work for you. So that's where you have to dig deeper and look for things like there's ability to use a shared role if you're only going to have one for one person in a particular account, where you can limit those things. But looking for those sneaky limits at the start, it's going to save you a lot of headaches down the road.
Yeah, that's an excellent best practice. So instead of being reactive, I think a lot of folks at the customer level especially have been in a place where you're being reactive. I think being proactive and being aware of those sneaky limits is an excellent best practice. So we've talked basics, we've talked best practices. Let's dive into a couple questions we have around how to mitigate. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of what you can do if you have large data volumes, or you think you might be treading on that area where you have large data volumes. Okay, so we have a question around, so classic question from at Sayantani. Sorry if I butchered that. So the question is around storage space. So we know that storage space in Salesforce can be pricey, right? So the question is, what should be done to keep data volume low? Do we move data out of Salesforce? And how do we start to think about moving data out of Salesforce? Anil, I know you have a lot of experience with archiving. Maybe we can talk a little bit about when we should archive and how often and all those good things.
Sure, Susannah. For me, I wouldn't only look at the storage space. I would rather look at it more from an holistic standpoint, end to end, on what is it that we are trying to achieve here, right? So obviously one aspect is the storage space. The other aspect, as we talked about earlier, is ensuring that your users are getting the optimal performance from the Salesforce platform that they're using. Ensuring that you are still able to serve even if the data is kind of taken off the platform, right? So what we have done is, I'm not really even talking here very large. I'm not probably talking about very large data volumes, right? The reason why I said very is we are not even talking about like 10 million or 20 million. Rather, we were talking about like 60 to 70 million records sitting in some of these objects, right? Which have been accumulated over a period of years, right? So it's a very methodical process that you would have to put in place if you want to really address this, not just purely from a storage standpoint, but also from an end-to-end journey that you're trying to address, okay? And the end-to-end journey could be for your agents, or the end-to-end journey that you're trying to accomplish for your customers. So when we really looked at this, we are like, okay, it's starting to impact our agents' experience. It's starting to impact our agents' efficiency. What do we do, right? So we looked at the whole landscape and said, there is some data that we can take off the platform, but at the same time, we don't want to lose that access to the data, because it's a gold mine. The data is a gold mine in today's world, right? And it's always important and easy for your agents to refer back something that they have addressed in the past. So when we really talked about archiving, it was not just about taking the data of the platform, shipping it out and just putting it in on some tape or on some disk or on cloud somewhere. That was not our intent. Our intent was, when we take out this, what is it that we are going to gain in terms of improving the agent experience? Then how do we still supplement that agent experience that they never feel that they lost the data and they still have access to this data? So what we have done was, the first and the foremost thing that is very important is to be able to, talk to your business users, understand what is it that they need and that they would be using often, and then agree on the business criteria in terms of, just as a simple example, can we remove the cases that are closed for more than 3 years, or can we remove the cases that are closed for more than 2 years? It depends. Each business probably has a different criteria, either because of the way how the business operates, or maybe because of the legality or the compliance reasons and things like that. So it's very important that you first have that understanding with your business users to make sure that you align with them on what is it that you want to take off the platform. And then at the same time, it's also equally important that you allow them to understand how you would be able to give that access, right? Now, how they would get access to that could be, it could be seamless for your agent, where from within the Salesforce, the data is getting served from another platform, right? Or it could be that if you have some sort of a global reporting, how would you bring that data in? So your archiving strategy needs to encompass this end-to-end, not just looking at take this data out and put it on some file server or on the cloud, right? So when we really did this, we executed this end-to-end approach, right? One is, okay, let's first work with the business users, understand what is the criteria that we can apply. Then we looked at it, okay, what are the solutions that we have available and how do we solve that problem to make sure that the agents still have this data access that's been archived and it's seamless for the agents. And then further, how do we support this data still complement it for reporting so that the global view is not lost, right? So, and this is where how we progressed on this end-to-end solution. And then we kind of closely work with you guys wherein, we archive the data. And when you're really archiving the data, it's not one or two objects. You're archiving the data across the chain of objects because you want to ensure that your hierarchy of objects, and the integrity of data across the hierarchy of objects that you're maintaining is properly kept intact, right? And that's very key so that when you have to really bring it back, in case if you have to bring it back, you're in a better position to be able to bring it back in a very, easier way.
Mhm. Excellent. So I heard, yeah, lots of different options, right? Depending on the business requirements. Always starts with the business requirements, and then looking at the different technology options that can support, like you said, Anil, whether it's sort of like a mashup of bringing that data back into Salesforce, or if it's pushing it off platform, maybe to a data lake or something like that. It all comes down to the business requirements of what's needed to run your business. I think that's excellent advice. And in the same line, Anil, if I may, do you have any advice? There's a question from at Salesforce_TJ around when you should archive. So you mentioned that you were archiving like 70 million records. Like how often are you archiving, and when should you even start thinking about it?
That's a very good question. It goes back to what Carl mentioned earlier on, right? So once you start getting into those multiples of millions of records, it's a trigger point for you to say that, okay, we need to start thinking about our archiving strategy, right? And then the question that's coming across is how often do we do, right? The way we do it every day, right? And again, it depends on why. It depends again. Probably some processes you are not accumulating data that much. In some processes, some business processes, you are accumulating data, really heavy, right? So you can define that based on the business process that you're trying to address, right? So there could be a business process one, which probably is generating, let's say 1 million records a month. Okay. There could be a business process two where you're generating probably about 100K records a month, right? So you have the flexibility that you can pick and choose which business process you want to do it on a daily basis or on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis. So there's no hard written rule that you always have to do it on a day or a week or a month. It's going back to the the prior discussion about what's the business expectation, right? And then what's the volume of the data growth that you have, and that is what is really driving the frequency at which you need to archive the data. Is it going to be daily, weekly, or monthly, or maybe once every 6 months, right? So I think it's very important that you really look at what's the data growth, what's the business requirement, and then based on this, arrive at the frequency of what you want to do and how you want to archive it.
I love that. Excellent. No, thank you. Thank you, Neil. I think that's great advice. Yeah. Data growth plus business requirements equal the frequency. I think that's a
Hey,
great.
Susannah,
Yes,
can I add one more point to that?
absolutely. Please, Carl.
I think it's also important to think about archiving before you need it. So in the example we heard, you have 70 million and you're adding 1 million a month. Well, let's say it takes 3 months for you to get your archive project up and running. Now you're at 73 million. How fast are you going to burn down that backlog to get to the level that you want? Maybe it's going to take another 6 months, maybe another 9 months. So there's that element of once you've accumulated so much, it's going to take some time before you can get that all out. So it's better to start before you hit that threshold than try and get down there.
Start sooner rather than later. I think that's, yeah, that's definitely great advice, right? Being, again, a common thread that I'm hearing is being proactive instead of reactive to a lot of these LDV concerns. Excellent. Okay, so I have another great question here. Oh, Anil, yeah, please go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I'm pitching in.
No, it's great.
Exactly. And I think that goes back to the question, like, what's the frequency? And I think that's something that we do on a daily basis, right? Because it's exactly the point that Carl is talking about, right? Don't wait till the, till it hits the roof, you start planning it prior, right? And that's exactly what we are trying to do here today, that we do it on a daily basis to secure that, we are doing it the right way.
Excellent. Proactive frequency. That's awesome. Okay. So moving on to a great question that we had sort of in the same topic area. So at Emmy Hansen 82 has a question. She's asking, what suggestions do you have for data that you want to retain for historical purposes, but you don't want to clutter related lists, etc. As an example, maybe inactive contacts for an account. Carl or Anil, actually, do you want to go ahead and take a stab at that?
Sure. It's again, it's a very tricky. There is no silver bullet to on what do you want to keep and how you're going to make it available, right? So it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation, right? So on one side, you're hitting the large data volumes. It's impacting your performance. It's impacting your efficiency. It's impacting your customer experience on one side of it. The other side of it is that the businesses equally really need the data to be able to have that 360-degree perspective, right? So one of the things that you can think of is that maybe you archive the data from the core of the Salesforce and then think about bringing that into your Einstein, not from a data storage standpoint, but from an analytical standpoint, right? If you don't have any of either of those needs, either from a data storage or from an analytical standpoint, it may be worthwhile for you to move that into your archiving store, right? But if you have these kind of, where you want to build these analytical data intelligence reports, then you probably may think about how can I bring that data over from my archive store into my analytics directly, so that you get that holistic perspective of what you want to do, right? And if there is a stale data, I don't think the stale data is really going to bring a lot of value to the business, because it's probably going to not allow you to make the right decision. So it's very important that you make sure that your data is most up to date, which means that you probably should be looking at archiving strategy when the data gets stale, as and when it becomes older and older. If the data is not really involved in transactions, you may worth consider to archive that particular data. And if there is no need for any kind of business intelligence or analytics on it, you may want to just leave it there in the archiving store.
Excellent. Anything to add, Carl?
Yeah, I think you can also run a little test, right? Because sometimes if you ask business questions, well, do you need that data? Yes, I need it. I need it forever. And when you, as an admin or user system, you look at the reports and you're like, it's not actually being used. You can take an intermediate step and let's create a sharing rule that basically hides this from everybody for a little while. And let's see if people ask for it, or take reports and put them in a placeholding folder because they're not being used. And it's a way just to run a test where you haven't gone fully to say archived, but you can build some data points to say, you know what, there is a lot of information we don't use. Here's what happened. Nobody missed it. So let's move forward with our archiving strategy. So a good way to kind of test it out with your company.
I love that. I think that's great advice. I know, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to the fact that when you go forward, you have a great idea to start an archiving policy and ask everyone what data can they live without. They say none of it, right? So, gotta get a little planful and a little strategic. Excellent. Okay, so I know that we probably have not hit on all the questions that we had, but I do want to give our amazing panelists just a moment to address maybe some really important topics that they think that the community should hear about related to LDV that maybe we haven't hit quite yet. So Carl, I'll start with you. What are your burning large data volume pieces of advice?
I think you've heard us talk about being proactive, but maybe I'll take you through my thought process of what that looks like. And I think it starts by planning, having some type of time horizon that you're looking at. You know, it may be the life of your Salesforce contract if you sign up for 3 years. If you don't have a time plan, 3 years seems good because it's enough to let you have companies grow, but things can always change. Along those lines, you're looking for impactful events. Hey, are we going to acquire a big competitor and double the size of our org overnight? So you're looking for those types of big drivers. Likewise, when you think about where data volumes come from, think about things that are relatively static. Yeah, you may have a lot of accounts today, but are you going to double the number of accounts in 3 years? Probably not. But what about the orders? What about the opportunities? You know, those are the places where the data volumes can definitely explode. And then you have to think about second order effects, right? If you have 10 million accounts, they're private, lots of roles, lots of sharing, go look at your share table. It's probably in the tens to hundreds of millions, 100, 200 million, because all of that gets magnified. If you're changing your accounts 5, 6 times a year, go look at your history table, right? So it drives even more volume in other places. And then the last thing is you have to be close, but not completely precise. Sometimes there's reluctance if you ask, well, how many accounts are we going to have? People feel like they have to give you an exact number. Like we have 1,317,000 and we're going to add, 5%. And you're like, no, it's okay to be wrong, but don't get the order of magnitude wrong. Are we talking millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions? That's what you're trying to get to from a planning perspective, because that'll help you make the right decisions.
Excellent. Excellent advice. How about you, Anil? What's your burning large data volume advice that you want to share out with the community?
Well, my advice is, I think, as I mentioned earlier on, plan in advance, and don't wait till you start seeing the issues, right? So keep an eye on your data growth. And once you start seeing a pattern of the way how the data is growing, you start thinking about, as an architect, that's what all we do, right? That we are not just looking at the problem at hand, but we are also looking at for a solution that can sustain for a long time, right? So you plan well in advance, look at your data growth, plan well in advance and say, okay, you know what, we need to put this in place, because it's not just about deleting the data, right? Especially when you're working in large enterprises, I'm sure there is a lot of alignments that you would have to do to make sure that the owners of the platforms understand what you're saying, the owners of the business units understand what you're saying, and then there are you need to secure the budgets to be able to execute the project and all that stuff. So it cannot be something that you work in a reactive or a fighting mode. Rather, you need to kind of do that in a well planned manner. So and I think, as we discussed earlier on, right, you already have a kind of like an idea on what is the volumes that you should start be worrying about, right? Once you start looking at, like, your object is containing more than 10 million records, start thinking about it. Hey, it's kind of reaching the peak. Should we start considering things about it? And if so, how do we go about it? Because um, it requires effort, not just from the technical teams. It's also requiring an investment from the company to make sure that you're choosing the right strategy that you want to put in place and how you want to go forward with that strategy.
Absolutely. Excellent. Okay. So I think we do have a couple of minutes left for lightning round, which I'm very excited about. I wish I had a little sound effect for the lightning round, maybe next time. But I have a bit of a potpourri of questions for you two. So they're not related to each other, but they are pretty interesting and pretty fun. So I'll start with the first one we got from @MitchSpano. And Mitch is asking, is it possible to use big objects in skinny tables with communities? What are the best practices for big objects? That's another one.
Okay, so I think two concepts here. Let's start with skinny tables, because skinny tables are really used internal to Salesforce. You don't see or access them directly. And if we dive deep on how Salesforce stores things, any of the standard fields are in one table in the database, and any of the custom fields are different. So if you think about account names over here, your key flag is over there. So if you want to pull back account name and whether it's key or not, I have to do a database join. I have to pull those things together. So what a skinny table does is it takes a certain number of those fields and puts it in one table, and there's no soft deleted rows. So it lets you return things quickly. So there's some use cases where that will help. If you put a skinny table out there and then you query something from a community, it will use the skinny table. From a big object perspective, so big objects, different concept, meant to hold hundreds of millions of records, but in a different way, so not in a relational way. What you have to do is you have to define an index on one or more unique fields. And then you have some different ways that you access it. You can write SOQL, but it has to use all the fields in the index starting from the left. So what does that mean? It means if you have two things, maybe you have a device log. You have the log date and then the device ID. You can query just off of the log date and get things back, but you can't query on the device ID because you have to do log date and device ID. So it's kind of limited in how you pull things back. If you want to query any which way, well, then that's when you use asynchronous SOQL. And what will happen is it actually takes the results, runs it, and puts it in another table, another S object. So now you have a normal S object. You can use that in a community. From granting access, yeah, you can do read, write, and delete to community users, both partner and customer.
Awesome. Okay, another one for you. So what if you have an external sharing model? Are there any known limitations to be made aware of?
And this is related to big objects, I assume, because it looks like it's from the same person. So yes, what's interesting there is big objects, they support object access and FLS, but there's not the concept of record sharing where you're going to have access, you can get it. But big objects are also limited that you're not going to just put a Salesforce report on top of it. You would need to use asynchronous SOQL and query that into another object, which then you could have the normal sharing rules if you wanted. If you're displaying it with SOQL, not async, you have to do that through your own custom component. You have to build some visual force. You have to put together a Lightning component. There's not a standard UI for it, which means in your controllers, you can programmatically control access to records that way. So even though it's not natively supported, there's some ways to get around what you can and can't do with big objects when it comes to sharing.
Awesome. Okay, last lightning round question. I'm going to pitch this one to Anil. What are the best practices for reporting off the platform data?
So one of the things is if you're using the Tableau CRM, right? If you're archiving the data into, let's say, S3 buckets, right? So you can probably use these native connectors that are available as part of the Tableau CRM and bring that into, for your analytics purpose, right? So that's one option, right? If you're not using Tableau CRM, but if you're using Tableau, then you probably can think of bringing this data directly into Tableau, right? That's one of the things, and all these things provide connectors where you can either bring the data directly from Salesforce or into these platforms, or you can bring the data from the archiving store. If you're storing them as like flat, you can bring them from the archiving store into these platforms and be able to build your business users.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I know we're right up against time. So I'm going to go ahead and give a big thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I know that there were so many more questions that we weren't able to get to. If we did not get to answering your question today, don't worry. Be on the lookout on social media. We will be likely posting some answers to additional questions. Even if you didn't get a chance to ask your question, feel free to post to @Odaseva and we will answer your question there. And finally, be on the lookout. So on Twitter, on LinkedIn, please give us a follow. We will be having more webinars like this. If you like this content, please do let us know. If you'd like to see different kinds of content, we'd also love to hear your feedback there. And then before we go, I do just want to give a huge thank you to our two panelists today, Anil Sistla and Carl Brundage. Thank you so much for your time. I know the community will really appreciate this.
Thank you, Susannah.
Thanks, guys. Bye.